So fungi exhibit really diverse lifestyles that include roles in the ecosystem as decomposers, rotting things like logs, dead bodies, and waste. Some of them are parasites, particularly in plants. Fungi are a common parasite. And then many of them are involved in mutualistic relationships. And like we've talked about with other organisms, for the most part, they have beneficial or neutral roles in the ecosystem. And while we might use examples of parasites, that we never mean that they're the most common form of the organism. So again, for the most part, they're providing important decomposition functions. Oops, there we go. So a couple of interesting things about fungi. Many fungi produce toxins in their fruiting body. So this is an example of ergot, which is a toxin produced by a fungus that grows on grain. In the case of ergot, it's hallucinogenic. And so when people eat it, they can have hallucinations and things like that. Some people think that may explain the Salem witch trials. People have studied the harvest and rain cycles during that time period. And what they noticed was that they were particularly wet years, which means the grain probably got harvested when it was damp. And damp grain tends to grow ergot more. And they think that perhaps the ergot got into the grain supply, and maybe that explains why there was sort of this mass hysteria almost, with a lot of people claiming that they'd seen the devil and all kinds of different things. Some toxins can cause liver failure. So some of the poisonous mushrooms are known for this. The liver failure is irreversible, and so the only way to survive is with a liver transplant. So it's important that if you want to collect wild mushrooms, that you really become an expert or talk to an expert about how to identify them. A really unusual lifestyle, but also possible for fungi, is in this example here. This is a predator fungi, and again, this is extremely unusual but kind of interesting. The fungi is able to actually trap a living organism rather than just decaying dead matter like most of them do. So it's catching this nematode, which is also called a roundworm. It's a type of microscopic animal that we'll talk about later in the semester. And it's going to now eat it. So a little bit of an unusual fungal lifestyle. As I mentioned before, fungal pathogens are particularly common in plants. Many of them are serious crop diseases. They spread really easily because the spores can be transported on the wind. They can be on the seeds that are transported. They can be on the produce when it's transported. They can also just be hanging out in the soil. And so a lot of times the spores will just splash up onto the plants, and that spreads the disease. And so that you can see this crop here has some yellowing that is caused by the growth of a fungus inside of the plant tissue. There are some human diseases that are fungal. Athlete's foot is a familiar one. Ringworm is a familiar one. These are skin fungal infections, relatively minor in seriousness and really common as well. A much more rare one is a fungi associated with pneumonia. Pneumonia describes the symptoms of lung problems. This had never really been seen before until AIDS started to occur. So individuals who are suffering from the symptoms of AIDS become immunocompromised, and one of the things that they can catch is this fungal pneumonia. Fungi participate in a lot of positive relationships with organisms. And so remember, these are called mutualisms. So let me write that word here for you. And in particular, they really do this a lot with photosynthetic partners. Remember, they're autotrophic. So a benefit that many times a fungus can get is access to nutrients. So we'll talk about 3 types of mutualistic relationships that fungi have with photosynthetic partners. The first here is the Mycorrhizae. This is the association between the roots of a plant and fungi. So the fungal Mycorrhizae is growing all around and with the plant roots. So this is a tree seedling, and we see Mycorrhizae surrounding that, obviously sort of growing out from that area. This relationship is really important for plants, and we can assume that because the majority of land plants have Mycorrhizae that live with them. The relationship helps the plants, so the plus for the plants is nutrients and water. So the fungi help increase the movement of water and nutrients in the soil. So these little hyphal branches are creating little paths for nutrients and water to get to the roots. And the fungi, their benefit is sugar, organic food molecules from the plant. 2 types of Mycorrhizae that we'll talk about are endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae. Endo is a root for in, and ecto is for out, and this is going to relate to the cell walls of the plants. Endomycorrhizae, again, that root means in. Endomycorrhizae are going to be able to get into the space inside of the cell walls and actually grow their hyphal branches into that space. So if this is the cell wall, then we have the cell membrane. And then the fungi, let me try a different color here. The fungi is going to be able to grow into this space. So this is the hypha of the fungus. And so again, it's penetrating into that interior area, which is where the root endo comes from. Arbuscular mycorrhizae, called AM fungi, is a group of closely related fungi that create this really high surface area inside of the space inside the cell wall. And you can see it here as well for transfer of nutrients. And while it almost looks like that would be hurting the plant cell, it doesn't. Because remember, it's getting into this space, but it's not getting into the actual plant cell. So it's changing the shape of the plant cell, which is what we see here. So as it pushes up against the plant cell, it can change the shape of the plant cell, but that doesn't hurt the plant cell. And remember, it's actually helping the plant by helping it get better routes for nutrients and water. Ectomycorrhizae grow on the outside of the cell wall. So if I were to use my diagram again, so there's the cell wall, there's the plant cell membrane, and then the fungi is growing out here. So it is outside of the cell wall. And you can see that in this image here. There's the hyphal branches growing in between the cells, but not actually into that interior space. So they really get in and kind of coat the outside of the cell wall. And there are a lot of ectomycorrhizal partners, and in many cases, they are absolutely required. So several oaks, beeches, pines, if they don't have their fungal partner, they don't grow. So not only is it a benefit, but it is a need for many of the plants that have this relationship. Endophytes are also a mutualism between plants and fungi, but it's a little bit of a different relationship because it's a relationship with the leaf of the plant. So Mycorrhizae is with the roots, endophytes are with the leaves. The fungal benefit is still sugar. So for fungi, they're still getting sugar. But for the leaf, the plant leaf benefit is protection from pathogens. So protection from pathogens or herbivory, that is being eaten by other animals. So again, it's still a plant, but it's with leaf tissue instead of root tissue. And that means the benefit is different. The fungi help protect the plant from pathogens and herbivory rather than improving absorption from the soil. And these are not required, but you oftentimes see that plants with endophytes grow better than ones without. The third mutualism we'll talk about is between photosynthetic algae or bacteria. So remember, algae is sort of our catch-all term for protists that are photosynthetic, and then bacteria that are photosynthetic are more specifically called cyanobacteria. So this is one partner, and then the other partner is fungi. So one thing that's really interesting about lichens is that this is not an animal, it's not an organism, it's not a plant. This name equals the combination of the two organisms. So a lichen can only exist when you have two organisms present. The nature of the relationship is really similar in some ways. So the fungi are still benefiting by getting sugar. And then the photosynthetic partner is benefiting by getting help accessing water, help accessing minerals, especially if they're growing on rock, and in some cases help getting CO2 as well. So the fungi might actually directly deliver CO2 to the algae or the bacteria instead of them having to extract it from air. Lichens have different body forms. So here's several examples. We have crustose, which gets its name from kind of looking like a crust growing on rock in this example here. Foliose, which is this example here, which gets its name from having almost leafy looking structures that form. Foliose referencing leaf or foliage. And then the fructicose, which is when you actually get these structures that stick up and almost just look more like, for lack of a better term, like a plant or a branch or stem. But again, they don't include plants at all. This is just what forms when you have these algae or bacteria growing with fungi. This is a cross section where you can see the layer of photosynthetic organisms and the fungal tissue in combination with each other. Lichens are involved in decomposition, so the fungi that are involved are oftentimes helping to break down this rock. So when you see lichen growing on a rock, that rock is slowly decomposing, and that's where the minerals come from that are provided to the photosynthetic partner. So you've gotten a taste for fungal roles in the ecosystem by now, I hope. So remembering that they're decomposers, that many of them are involved in mutualistic relationships, that they're helping plants do a lot of stuff, especially. And while there is a small but significant amount of pathogens, the pluses by far outweigh the negatives. Humans also have some specific uses we get out of fungi. We really commonly use fungi to produce some industrial products. So when you say citric acid on an ingredient list, which take a look at any candy or juice or soda or things like that, you're really commonly going to see citric acid listed there. Glycerol is in a lot of food products as well as cosmetics, and then antibiotics. are all produced commercially by fungi through their naturally occurring processes. Many of our food products can come from fungi. So blue cheese is one example, though there's many other types of cheese that have fungal growth on them. So white molds are really common on things like brie, for example. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, I mentioned earlier. This is more commonly called baker's yeast or brewer's yeast. It's the same species, just slightly different strains, whether you want to make beer, wine, or bread. And then there's also some use for them in industrial processes like wood pulp bleaching, so when they're trying to make white paper out of wood. So those are all some benefits we get from fungi. So a wrap-up question here: will plants grown in sterile soils have more or less productivity than plants grown in normal soils? So we're comparing sterile soil versus normal soil. So sterile soil, that means no living things in it. So the advantage to that is that there's no pathogens. So that's why someone might want to use sterile soil. So that's the pro. The disadvantage is that there's no mutualistic organisms. In normal soil, the disadvantage is that you might have some pathogens, but the advantage is that you also have your mutualisms, your mutualistic organisms present. So let's look at the options. More, because mature plants are often attacked by pathogenic fungi. Well, there is the potential for pathogens. Mature plants, like adult humans or animals, mature plants are less vulnerable than babies. So that's something to think about. More, because mold spores germinate and overtake the plants. Well, that's not likely because the sterile soil is not going to have the mold, right? Less, because plants in the sterile soils don't have the mycorrhizal fungi to aid in nutrient absorption. Okay, so that makes sense with this one over here. Less, because plants cannot complete photosynthesis without help from fungi. Well, that's not actually true. Plants can do photosynthesis. They just get a benefit from their mutualisms, right? And then none of the above. Well, I think we can eliminate that because we've got two possibilities here. So really we're asking, does the benefits of the mutualisms outweigh the pathogens? And in mature plants, the answer is yes. So this would actually be true. Less, because plants in the sterile soils don't have the mycorrhizal fungi. So if you go to a nursery, you can actually buy sterile products or things that have less pathogens. So people a lot of times use seed starting mix, and it is more sterile than regular soil. But that's because baby plants can be more vulnerable. But this is also why you can't keep the plant in that same soil. So as it matures, you have to move it to non-sterile soil in order for it to continue to grow.